I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, we're in the section on developing calm abiding. Right? So developing, it's like a meditative stabilization called calm abiding. And what we've been talking about, just to kind of get back to sort of integrate back up to where we're up to, what Lama Tsongkhapa has been talking about in this section, earlier on he pointed out that calm abiding, this kind of state of meditation, has a quality of abiding on the object of meditation, right? So whatever one is meditating on, that one sort of doesn't lose the object. So a kind of quality of concentration, in that sense, of mindfulness. And then a quality of clarity, that the object appears very clearly to the mind. And now he's talking about he's been going through different explanations about how do you cultivate this mind of calm abiding. And he's been talking about how, he's talking about two major obstacles. And I won't go through all the details, but in brief, one is excitement, which is a mind of desire that jumps away from your object, right? So in excitement, if you're trying to meditate on the image of a Buddha, your mind, because of your habituation to desire, the mind jumps away and starts thinking about something else. Or the other one is laxity, and laxity is where the mind lacks vitality or lacks clarity. So it's kind of, it's not holding the object brightly enough. So there could be a kind of holding the object, but with a kind of, without enough vitality or energy or concentration. And so it's a kind of dull meditation. And again, he made this point, right, many times, Lama Tsongkhapa points this out, that people sometimes mistake a kind of laxity without losing the object for good meditation. And he's saying that's not actually good meditation. So he goes into a lot of detail about that point because it's a point that he's saying is commonly misunderstood. It's hard, like at the beginning, as we'll get into, it's hard to even hold the object, right? But then when people gain this ability to hold the object, but with a kind of lax mind, they feel like they've made a lot of progress because it's a quite peaceful feeling. But he's saying that there are many negative side effects of that, and you don't progress in your meditation. You kind of plateau at that point, and you don't progress. So he's saying don't mistake that for good meditation, or for the goal of meditation. And then he pointed out that that two of the main ways of countering excitement and laxity, and ways of progressing in your meditative concentration. One is mindfulness. Right, and in this sense, mindfulness is remaining mindful of whatever you're meditating on. Right? So not losing the object. Right? So mindfulness kind of, and he used a metaphor in the last section. He said mindfulness is like, if you decide to meditate on your breath, let's say, right? Then mindfulness, he used this metaphor, he said it's like if you have like a wild elephant that you're trying to tame, you might, in ancient India, they would sort of have a rope tying it to a tree to stay in the area, otherwise it would just run away, and then they couldn't teach it. Right? So he's using that as a metaphor. He's saying, in a similar way, our mind is crazed and wild, and so we tie it to something. Right? In other words, we make a decision in our mind. I'm going to connect my mind. I'm going to tie it. I'm going to not let it drift away from whatever the object is. And he gave different examples. Right? It might be the breath. It might be the image of a Buddha. Could be any of various objects. So mindfulness is what sort of keeps the mind on the object. But then he says there's a second tool for developing meditative concentration that we need, and that's introspection. Right? And in this context, introspection has a particular meaning, right? Because sometimes when we say introspection, we could just mean like thinking about your own internal processes, which is a valid meaning of that word, but in this context it has a specific technical meaning, which is that you're every now and then checking up on your own mind to see if it's drifting away from the object, to see if it's having excitation and going away based on desire, to see if it's even beginning to have that tendency to go away, or to see if it's having laxity, right? Where it's going to not be clear enough or vital enough or something in its concentration. So in this sense, that the kind of introspection you're developing is one that's checking up on the quality of your own meditation. Right? So you're looking at your own process in your own mind and analyzing how, or not analyzing, but checking up, a better way to say it. Because you're not sort of cognitively thinking about it a great deal. You've already studied, you would have studied what are excitement, what is excitement, what is laxity, and so on. But when you're actually doing it, you're just sort of checking, how am I doing? If you're doing well, then you leave it, right? If there's a problem, then you address it, and we'll get into how, but that's introspection. Okay, so now that's where we left off. And so then Lama Tsongkhapa says, well then, how do you generate introspection? Right, so he's raising this question, how does a person develop the ability to have good introspection? And he says the most essential cause is the method for sustaining mindfulness presented earlier. So, and he goes on to explain. So what he's basically saying here is, and it's something I've mentioned before, that first we have to focus on developing mindfulness, right? Mindfulness of the object, of whatever object we've chosen to meditate on. Because actually, if you don't have mindfulness, if your mind's continually jumping away, right? Well, then there's nothing to check up on, actually. I mean, what you'll be doing is you'll be checking up and going, oh, I'm thinking about this, oh, I'm thinking about that, oh, but as you develop your mindfulness that stays with the object, then you can every now and then just check, how is my mindfulness doing? Right? And so he says, as you stop forgetting the object and wandering off, you can then become more sensitive to what's the quality of my meditation. That's a better way to put it. It still takes some effort, right? You have to actually, so he's saying, and actually this is where I was saying another time, and later he'll go into detail about this. So he's saying, first develop stability. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, if you don't have some stability in your meditation, you can't worry about the clarity yet. And if you worry about the clarity too quickly, or or the details of sort of how you're doing, then you'll immediately lose the object of meditation, right? You'll try to introspect, and your introspection will become a distraction. But if you develop some stability through your mindfulness, then you can start this practice of checking up. And we'll see later when he presents like 9 stages of meditation. You can use introspection right from the beginning, but really if you check, when you look at later, there are 9 stages that one progresses through in developing calm abiding. And you'll see that the power of introspection doesn't come in the first 2 or 3, it comes later. So it's not, so first you really do focus on mindfulness, not losing the object. Does that make sense? And then once you develop that to some degree of facility, you'll still use a little bit of introspection early on, but it doesn't become really powerful until later. when you develop more mindfulness first. So he's pointing this out. He's saying, so first, focus on mindfulness, on not losing the object, on developing some sense of stability, and then gradually, you'll start from the beginning, but gradually you'll become more and more able to check up on yourself, to introspect, and to see how's my meditation going. And he says, if you proceed in that way, you will then become, he says here, hence you will recognize lasting excitement easily. He says, this is very clear when you look at it from the perspective of your own experience. The amount of time it takes you to recognize laxity and excitement when mindfulness is deteriorated, and the amount of time when it is not. Right? So he's saying if you're sustaining your mindfulness well, then it'll be easy and quick to actually catch those things. Whereas if you're not keeping the object, it's going to be very difficult. So that's clear. And then he quotes a text that says, mindfulness he says the text speaks of mindfulness as the cause of introspection. And then Lama Tsongkhapa very briefly makes a point here. He says, I'll actually read this line. He says, this one cause is to observe the aspect of the deity's body and the like, right? So he's talking about whatever you're meditating on. It could be the image of a deity, that which is being apprehended. And then he says, or the aspect of the apprehender. I just want to point something out, because sometimes in the tradition coming from Lama Tsongkhapa, it's pointed out here that up to this point, Lama Tsongkhapa is mainly, when he talked about what do you meditate on, he talked about the breath, he talked about love, compassion, all these different examples, patience and so on, and then he talked about different images, and then he sort of said, and for many people, the image of the Buddha, right? So that's where he says the deity's body. Right? So he's saying whatever you're meditating on, for example, the deity's body or whichever other object, meaning the Buddha in this case. Or it could be some other, Buddha or Bodhisattva. And then he says, or the aspect of the apprehender. There he's making a reference to a different object of meditation, right? Which actually is what is taught in the Mahamudra tradition. And Lama Tsongkhapa himself didn't, there was an oral tradition of Mahamudra that came down from Lama Tsongkhapa that was written then in the text by the first Panchen Lama. But here he mentions that, right? So he's saying another object of meditation one can meditate on is the mind itself, the apprehender, right? So he's saying that you could choose that also as your object of meditation. Here he briefly mentions that, but he doesn't go into great detail. But that is it's another commonly used object of meditation, is to meditate on the nature of mind itself. So it's another option.
What page are you on?
219 at the bottom. And he says here, such as the experience of mere awareness and mere clarity. And so there, I just point out, since he's talking about it, there, instead of meditating, ordinarily he's been talking about, for example, you might meditate on the image of a Buddha right in front of you. But here, you don't meditate on a visual image of anything, actually. In the meditation technique he's mentioning very briefly here, he's saying mind itself, right, the apprehender, right, the subject. The apprehender is consciousness, right, awareness. And he's saying, and so he's saying you experientially would notice either of two things about awareness itself. One is its quality of awareness, its quality of knowing, in other words. That mind, by its very nature, has a kind of a natural quality of knowing, or of apprehending, of perceiving. And the other is it's clear, right? Clear in the sense that it's unobstructed, like space. Mind is not a physical phenomenon. It's a subjective experience, so it's clear in that sense. And so he's saying another thing a person could do is to become aware of awareness itself, either its aware quality or its clear quality, and then apply mindfulness to that, right? So then you would try not to lose that object of awareness. So that's like mind perceiving mind. Right? And that's just another that's just another way of developing calm abiding. For instance, you would, instead of visualizing a Buddha, you would meditate on the nature of mind. Of course, to do that, you have to be able to sort of recognize the nature of your own mind. So it's a harder object in the beginning, maybe to find. With a Buddha, of course, you can just put a statue in front of you and look at it long enough, and then close your eyes and visualize and keep looking. And eventually, it's not so hard to sort of create a mental image of the Buddha. The breath is quite easy. To meditate on awareness itself, you have to be able to notice those qualities experientially, as he's saying. Yes, you have to experientially be able to get I mean, even you can read the words awareness and the word clarity, right? The word knowing or something. But you have to practice Mahamudra, of course, you have to actually be able to experientially identify in your own experience that, and then practice mindfulness of that. But you can't be mindful of something until you're familiar with it. So you have to become familiar with that quality, with those qualities of the apprehender, meaning of awareness itself. So there, Lama Tsongkhapa is making reference to what's sometimes called Sutrayana Mahamudra, because then there's another tradition, Mahamudra, in the Tantric tradition, but here he's making reference to Mahamudra as it's taught in the Sutra tradition, which is often taught also, I mean, the Gelugpa tradition teaches that, and the Kagyu tradition also has a strong tradition of teaching Mahamudra in that sense. So he's talking about different, so he's saying, you choose your object of meditation, whether it be the image of a deity or Buddha, or whether it be consciousness itself, and then you be mindful of that. And then he's saying with introspection, you're watching to see if your mind is scattering away from whatever you're meditating. Right? So that's the function of introspection, is to see, first you're seeing if you're scattering away from it, then you're also checking the quality after that, of the vividness of your awareness. And actually, I'll just make one more brief point, on this point. This is also a difference, actually. I just want to notice that ordinarily when mindfulness is taught in the West, I mean, based on the scientific research, right? Actually, it has a different goal, where it's the same techniques. I mean, there's the techniques of mindfulness as is taught in the West. John Kabat-Zinn and so on, the people who initiated that research, were practicing Buddhism. Actually, right? John Kabat-Zinn was a practitioner of Zen Buddhism, and others practiced Vipassana, and so the techniques were taken from Buddhism, and that's good. I mean, it was explicitly said, and that's what. Not taken in the sense of inappropriately, but offered, maybe is what I say. But actually, the research on those techniques, the goal there, right, is to decrease mindfulness-based stress reduction. Right? So it's to decrease stress, or the goal is to decrease anxiety or depression or things like that. And so in those techniques, they don't actually. I teach them sometimes. There's not an emphasis on overcoming laxity, right? Because for somebody whose mind is anxious and excited, they're just trying to calm the mind down, right, and decrease too much conceptualization, which we call rumination in psychological research. But so there's not this emphasis on overcoming laxity, and that's because the goal is not enlightenment. The goal is just to calm down and stop too much conceptualization. So it's not really emphasized too much. Whereas when you get into Buddhist meditation, actual formal Buddhism, in other words, it includes everything that's taught in that mindfulness, kind of scientific mindfulness movement. But there are many additional points that are taught, because you're getting into much, much deeper, the goal is much deeper states of concentration in order to gain insight into the nature of reality. Right? That's not the goal of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Those are wonderful techniques. I'm not discouraging them. I think they're excellent. But the goal is different. Does that make sense? Since the goal isn't to develop insight into the nature of reality, it's just to calm the mind down and to sort of stop rumination and decrease anxiety and stress and so on. It's not that level of subtlety. But in the Buddhist context, if you want to progress, first of all, the deep states of meditative concentration and that one can achieve through calm abiding, then you need that clarity. Right? Also, if you want to use your meditation to gain insight, what they call vipassana, right, actual insight into the nature of reality, then you need clarity. So that's a difference. In other words, just in terms of emphasis. Anyway, so that's it. Okay. And he says, he quotes actually Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, saying, investigating again and again the state of the body and mind in brief, just that alone is the characteristic of guarding introspection. And so there, what he's saying, right, is that there's a kind of almost almost a vigilant, I mean, sometimes you could say vigilance, right? Introspection or vigilance. There's a very close attention and in the moment by moment to that starts to develop to one's own meditative process. Right? And part of that, as we'll get into in a little while, is, because here, remember also, right, like there's an underlying, the meditator, right, in this context, who's trying to develop calm abiding, has a powerful intention, actually. And in this context, that powerful intention is compassion, right, bodhicitta. Right, in other words, so the person who's meditating in this context is trying to develop meditative concentration, not just to calm down or not just to have a more peaceful day, but in order to become enlightened for the welfare of others, right? And they're aware of the suffering of others, and they have compassion for that suffering, their own suffering and the suffering of others. So for that person, their practice of meditation, as I said, has a certain vigilance or intensity or powerful motivation, which is moved by compassion. And so that's, again, it's different than just sort of a relaxation technique or something like that. And then he says, as you get better at, so first you develop the mindfulness, then you develop introspection, and then he says, by doing this, you therefore generate introspection that recognizes any laxity or excitement as soon as they are about to arise. By means of applying mindfulness, on the other hand, the forgetfulness of your mind, being distracted and wandering off, is stopped, so that you observe well whatever you're meditating on. So he's saying a couple things. One is you need to know the difference between mindfulness, right, which holds the object, and introspection, which checks up on are you getting distracted, are you getting lax, and so on. But the other thing it's implied there, right, is as you get better, at the beginning, you're not going to have introspection that notices before, right? He's saying here, introspection catches laxity just as it's about to arise. Right? Now, of course, at the beginning, you're not going to have that, because it's a skill, right? But he's saying, like any skill, you'll get better and better at it the more you do it. And if you practice these techniques, this kind of meditation, regularly, he's saying there will eventually come a point where you'll notice laxity as it's about to arise, or excitement as it's about to arise. And then you can cut it off before it even arises to disturb your meditation. But that, of course, comes only through developing that ability, right? I mean, at the beginning you don't have any introspection, then you gradually develop it, and eventually you reach this point where you can catch it before it fully arises, or as it's beginning to arise in the mind. And that's a sign of great progress. Any questions before I go on? Okay, let's keep going. So he says, basically what we were just saying, right? He says if you keep making effort, eventually a kind of strong mindfulness will arise, so that even subtle laxity and excitement can be recognized by means of introspection. And then that way you won't have the fault of not noticing if you're lax or excited. Remember, because in the last section, those were here, like he said, he's something funny. He said, if you don't yet have any introspection, and then you think, oh, I'm doing great meditation, I don't have any laxity or any excitement because you didn't notice them, that's not a good sign. He's saying, don't mistake the lack of introspection and therefore not noticing that you're lax or excited for actually not having laxity and excitement. I think sometimes that's Lama's sense of humor coming through, but also making a point. So here he's saying, if you develop very strong mindfulness, and then you cultivate a kind of introspection that comes along with that, but with mindfulness coming first as an emphasis, and then the introspection, then eventually you'll develop this ability to catch them as they're about to arise. And then he says, however, non-application or accepting the lack of endeavor or effort, and a failure to cultivate endeavor or effort to stop those two as soon as they arise is a great fault. And so he's saying here something important, which is, again, like, we have to, and this is where, if somebody's just practicing meditation but doesn't know, right? First of all, if you don't know that laxity and excitement are problems, well, then you just don't do anything about them, right? Then he's saying also, if you don't really understand the benefits of calm abiding, And if you don't sort of develop a kind of intention, really, to overcome laxing excitement, then you won't overcome it. And then your meditation won't progress. And what he's getting at here is that, that developing meditative concentration requires effort, actually. It doesn't come about like effortlessly. And I'll say more about that later, so I won't say more about it now. I'll wait till he does. But and another point he's making here is, and he says here, the outline says, identifying the intention and how to stop laxing excitement. So what he's saying here is intention, first of all, well actually he'll define it, is a mental factor, and it's what one needs in order to overcome laxing excitement. And this is part of Buddhist psychology, actually. So he raises this question from the Compendium of Knowledge, which is an Abhidharma text. He says, so what is intention? Because you need intention in order to overcome laxing excitement. And what he says is, actually I'll read the formal definition. It is the mind creating compositional factors, action, meaning karma, of the mind, that has the function of causing the mind to get involved in virtue, non-virtue, or something neutral. And then he says, that means that the mental factor that moves the mind and impels it to something, whether it be virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral, is intention. Right? And so actually, intention, right, we always have, I mean, he's getting at a Buddhist psychological point here, from a point from Buddhist psychology, which is, first of all, we always have intention, actually, even if it's neutral, right? Like, so if there is, and he said, actually, he makes one more point. He says it's like, I think he makes a point. He uses a metaphor. He says, if you put a piece of iron and then a magnet near it, the iron will go towards the magnet. Right? And he's saying intention is like that magnetic pull. Right? So he's giving an example of the experience of what intention's like. And so, let's say this right. If you watch your own mind, right, the mind goes towards something. Your mind may go towards, like, oh, I want this person to like me. That's intention. Your mind may go towards, like, oh, I want that for lunch. That's intention. Right? Your mind may go towards, like, oh, I want to drive now. That's intention. Right? And in some, like, so the example, I want to drive now, that's neutral. It's a neutral. And if he's saying neutral, positive, or negative, right? A positive, right, if you think, oh, like, if you feel love for someone and want to be kind to them, right, that's a positive intention, right? If you get angry at somebody and want to scowl at them, that's a negative. I mean, when he's saying positive, negative, and neutral, right? So the intention is not something unusual for us. We always have.
Just out of curiosity, where does survival fall in there? Positive, negative, or neutral?
Oh, interesting question. First of all, I've not seen it. I've not seen that addressed in a Buddhist text. That's what I was pausing just to think. So I can only answer based on my own thinking, like about it. But in Buddhism, in Buddhist psychology, in the sense, there are certain things that are like intrinsically positive, like love, for example, and then there are some that are intrinsically negative, like hate. And then there are some that are, they call them like changeable, like in the sense that they could be either positive, negative, or neutral. And a traditional example of that is sleep. Like, in other words, sleep is a neutral thing, but it can be positive if a person's sleeping out of a sense of, let's just say this right. Like, on the one hand, if a person goes to sleep feeling, I want to rest so I can, like, do more good tomorrow, it's something that's not intrinsically, sleep is not intrinsically a positive or negative thing, but it gets infused with positivity because of the motivation. And whereas if the person goes to sleep feeling, like, I'll get even with that jerk tomorrow, I need my energy to go beat them up, that would be, then sleep kind of gets infused with a negative quality. So I would think survival would be similar, right? Like, that's just my own thinking.
Makes sense, yeah.
Right? Because, in and of itself, survival doesn't have, like the Dalai Lama often says that, right? He points out, like, for human beings, he says, like, I mean, he jokes sometimes. He says, well, human life is very precious, right? Like, in other words, that because we have this ability to make spiritual progress. And he says, but on the other hand, human beings can make more trouble than other species. than any other species does.
So what's
too. It
making
does.
me want to survive here? Do I want to like slaughter everybody, or do I want to like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so
Cool.
I think, in and of itself, I think it's just a neutral phenomenon probably, but if it's infused with a sense of, so like a bodhisattva who wants to survive to be of service to others, that would clearly be positive, whereas, somebody who says, well, I want to survive in order to,
Or even because I don't want to die, that's still pretty selfish. There's
Oh,
there's
that
no
would
good
be-
intention in there. Right?
yeah, so that would be a neutral one though, actually, because then it's not intrinsically, you're not trying, there's not a, I think, if a person just wants to survive, I think that would be neutral, because it doesn't have a specific sort of harmful intention, but also doesn't have a particular good intention. So I think, like sleep, like if a person just goes to sleep because they're tired, that's neutral. It doesn't have a particularly positive or negative. Kind of, there's some attachment there, maybe, but it's not intrinsically to harm, so it's considered neutral. So I think it would be like that, just a natural part of being human. But we can make it positive or negative. I think, like sleep. Yeah.
Cool, thanks for
That's my own thinking on it, at least. I think that makes sense.
that. It makes sense to me.
So you get this idea. So intention's always there. Even if it's the intention to do nothing, right? Like sometimes we have intention to just relax. Well, that's still an intention. Anyway. So what he's saying here is, here therefore understand that it is intention. So one develops the intention to develop meditation free of laxity and excitement, right? And therefore the intention to overcome laxity and excitement when they arise. Does that make sense? So one goes into meditation with that kind of intention. Because if you don't have that kind of intention, you won't do that. And what he's getting at there is that what actually overcomes laxity and excitement is this quality of an intention in your own mind. You have to have that intention, right? And it's that intention that does the work. Introspection allows you to know if you're being excited or if you're having excitation or laxity. But it's intention that moves the mind to overcome it. Does that make sense? So he's differentiating. So the intention is, or is the introspection is more about an awareness of if they're occurring. But then you have to have this intention as a quality of mind in order to overcome those things. And then he goes into how do you overcome them? Okay, so he goes through different techniques for each. And so he says, so how do you stop laxity and excitement? And then he starts with laxity. And he says, the mind that is lax has withdrawn inward too much and lost its mode of apprehending the object. Right? So laxity, actually is an interesting description, right? On the one hand, like, he's describing a psychological state here, right? Or an inner state, whatever you want to call it. Not emotional, really. A state of mind, right? So it's experiential. And so he's saying experientially it feels like the mind has withdrawn inward too much, right? Like it's closed in upon itself. And it's lost its mode of apprehending the object. So that means, as we said before, it's lacking a certain vitality or a certain energy or a certain clarity of holding its object. It may not have lost the object, right? Eventually it will if it goes too far into laxity, but even if it still has the object, there's not that vitality or that clarity or that way of apprehending whatever you're meditating on. So if you're meditating on your breath, for example, right, but you're not seeing it clearly, right? You're not sort of really aware. There's not a vividness, call it, or vitality to your awareness. That'd be an example of that. And so then he says something interesting. He says, so if you find that your mind has laxity, he says, you should attend to a cause for the mind to move outward again, something joyful. Right? So he's saying that the mind has kind of become too, and earlier he used this metaphor of like, as if the mind is in darkness, like as if you're kind of like, somebody turned off the lights, right? That the mind is not seeing clearly. And so then you want to develop a sense of light, or of joy, or of kind of a little more outward focus, a little more energy. And so then there's this. Actually, I won't I was thinking, I won't cover this in the exactly, I won't read what he said, but rather I made a list of all the different ones that are mentioned. And so, one is, he says you can just visualize light, like sunlight or moonlight. And others, you can actually look at light, right? Like, so if you're actually like, this is what I think, yogis in Tibet had a good, an advantage, right? You could just turn and look out of your hut or your cave and see that. But that's also why, like, traditionally there's a tendency to meditate in, like, like caves or like up in the hills, up in the mountains, and so on. It's conducive for this purpose. Right? But so one is you can actually look at, or you can visualize, like the sun, right? So actually, what do you have to do here? Is if you're noticing you're having laxity, actually it's an important point. Maybe I'll go through this in different order. What he says is, if you notice laxity, the first thing you can do is try to just try to increase the intensity, right? To try to bring up the vitality or the energy of your meditation. If that works, then don't do anything else, right? Like if you just notice, oh, I'm just a little bit lax, let me energize my meditation, and that works, then you're good. Then just abide. Right? But then he's saying, if you try that and it doesn't work, what do you do? So he's saying, actually, you stop your meditation. So if you're meditating on, say, the image of let's say your breath, right? You stop meditating on your breath, you take a break for a few minutes, and you visualize the sun, or you visualize the moon, or you go and look at the moon or the sun. And the point is that creates a kind of lightness in your mind, and then you go back to your original object of meditation. Does that make sense? Another is, he says, you can think of, visualize a Buddha made of light. Again, it's the same thing. It's like sort of inspire. The idea would be inspiring, and it would be the lightness would wake your mind up, or kind of bring more vitality to your mind, more lightness. Another is, he says, think of things that are inspiring, and he gives the example of thinking of the qualities of the Buddha, or the qualities of the Dharma, or the qualities of the Sangha. But he's saying, inspire yourself, right? Because if you get inspired, your mind will have more energy. Then he says, or you can think about the great qualities of the spiritual goals you're seeking, right? Like what the qualities of bodhisattvas are, what the qualities of enlightened beings are, and so on. And therefore, also, again, inspire yourself in that way. Like, think, why am I doing this? What's my motivation? What am I really trying to achieve? And if you feel some sense of inspiration, that will overcome your laxity. He says, or you can do any of the meditations. We had a section in the text earlier about joyous effort. Right? Remember that? Like what you take joy in and cultivating joy. So he says, any of the meditations from joyous effort will bring joy to your mind, and therefore will overcome laxity. So you can go and meditate on joyful effort. Then also, if you meditate on bodhicitta, that will overcome, because bodhicitta is very inspiring and filled with love and compassion, and your mind becomes very energized out of love and compassion. So he says meditating on bodhicitta also will overcome laxity. So he's just giving you a whole bunch of choices here, right? Or you can meditate on the preciousness of your human rebirth, how wonderful your human life is, and how rare and precious it is, and all its wonderful qualities. Again, with the idea that you would feel some sense of inspiration then. Then he says, if none of those things work, splash water on your face, because that will also help wake you up. Then he also quotes a text. I think it's this one's by a Sangha, the Shravaka Bhumi, the Shravaka levels, which lists 6 things. It says things, and it was just another teaching on the same topic, which overlaps. But again, it's inspiring things. So it's saying you can think. Sangha there said, think of the qualities of the Buddha, of the qualities of the Dharma, or the qualities of the Sangha, or think of the wonderful qualities of ethics, or think of the wonderful qualities of generosity, or think of one's deity. So he's just giving examples of things that might inspire a meditator. And then other examples, these aren't in this text, I think, but I saw them in other texts, was to look at a butter lamp, again, because light sort of inspires, or it doesn't inspire, light kind of wakes up the mind. Because again, it's sort of the opposite of the sense of being lost in darkness. So he says, look at candles or butter lamps, or if you look at a fire, it has that. Like there's a quality actually, if you sit by a bonfire, there's a quality to the mind that comes. So it's saying if there's a fire, like if you had a cooking fire or something, go look at it, and that will will also wake up your mind. And then I think those are all the ones that that Lama Tsongkhapa mentions. I'll mention one other one that actually Khentsur Rinpoche taught specifically for this purpose of overcoming laxity in the Easy Path, that book. And this technique comes from Padampa, the great yogi, Indian yogi, Padampa Sangye. And Lama Tsongkhapa's disciple Kedrub teaches it in a text, but it comes from Padampa Sangye. In this technique, which I just think is a beautiful one actually, you visualize, if you're really having the experience of laxity, Padampa Sangye says, visualize your own body as made of rainbow light, first of all. Right? So you actually think of your own body, you visualize it as if it's with all the colors, right, of a rainbow. And in the shape of your body, but so your body's in the shape of your body, but it's not solid, it's like a rainbow with multicolored.
It's fabulous.
Isn't that cool? Sometimes you see pictures, actually, there are painted tankas of that, like with, I've seen particularly Padmasambhava, where like, it's in the form of Padmasambhava, but his body, but the painter,
It makes me want to cry.
the artist paints it as a rainbow. It's really beautiful. Yeah, it's a beautiful visualization, with all the colors of the rainbow. And then he says, and then while visualizing your body in the form of a translucent and transparent, and in the form of a rainbow, a multicolored rainbow, he says, in your heart, in the middle of your heart chakra, it's in the center of your chest, not on the outside, but inside your chest, visualize your mind in the shape of a small egg of light. And then Padampa Sangye says, then you say, pe, or pet, a syllable, and imagine that that small egg of light goes up to your throat. Then you say, pet, or pe, again, and it goes to your crown. Then you say, pe, again, and it shoots out into space and merges with infinite space. And then you just kind of identify in a kind of non-duality way your mind and infinite space, right? And the infinite space is light. Right? It's not the space. It's not a dark space. You visualize like your mind, almost like you would think of it this way, like the mind merging with a cloudless sky at dawn. That'd be like the image, or just after dawn, right? When it's light, but there's no clouds, and just like your mind is merged with that kind of space. And he says, and if you do that technique, you can do it once, you can do it a few times, that will also overcome laxity. You can see how that would work pretty well with it, if you can do that. But you get the idea. They're all like all these techniques are things that inspire you, or include the image of light. And one more point about this is, so Lama Tsongkhapa and then in this case Khentsur Rinpoche give all these different techniques for overcoming laxity. The reason being two things. One is, if you actually practice, right, you'll find that, first of all, on different days, different techniques may be what work for you. Does that make sense? Like, so, in other words, you might try, like, because you're a real person, it's not a machine, right? So, like, it's not like if you just say, oh, this technique will always work for me. So you need different options, because one day you may try something and it works great, and the next day you may try it and like it doesn't, you don't feel inspired. Like for example, bodhicitta. If you can connect to bodhicitta, that will overcome laxity easily. But if you're sort of feeling so heavy that you can't do that, then what do you do? Right? So then you might want to use the light. And that's why he says that if finally splash water in your face if nothing else is working. So you have to check for yourself which one works on a given day. And also you may notice certain ones work better for you versus somebody else. So then use whichever one works for you. Or ones, so you have you would have like your toolkit. You can pull out if you know one tends not to work for you, use the other ones. Because it's just a matter of, in this case, the point is to overcome the laxity and then go back to meditation. So whatever does that for you, that's good enough, right? And then go back. Oh, he also said, and one other one is look at the stars. If it's nighttime, you can look at the stars. That can also, right? Which actually can create. That's also archetypal, isn't it? If the sky's clear and you look at the Milky Way, there's something that just. It's something with sort of, it does something to your mind, right? Some sense of energy or something, And then if you go back to meditation, it'll be easier. So the stars will only work if you're meditating at night. And then he says, and then he's saying, he makes a point. He says, if the mental laxity, I'm on page 222 for those who are following, the top. But he says, if the mental laxity is very slight and does not occur more than once in a while, you should just tighten your mode of apprehension of the mind as you meditate. Right? So he's saying, that's what I was saying earlier. If you notice, like if you're meditating and you notice, oh, every now and then I'm just feeling a little bit of laxity, he says, then just tighten a little, and you're good. Keep going. But then he's saying, on the other hand, if the laxity starts happening over and over again and is dense, like a feeling of denseness, or like walking in the fog or something, he says that's when you stop. You do one of these other techniques, see which one works for you, and when the laxity stops, then go back to your meditation. Right? So that's the technique there. Aren't those quite beautiful, though, the range of techniques that he gives? Then he says, okay, so that's what to do. Is once your introspection notices repeated laxity, use one of those techniques, go back to your meditation, and continue on. Then he says, okay, then how do you stop excitement, right? Mental excitement. And then he makes a similar point. He says, when it comes to excitement, the mind runs after forms, sounds, and other objects due to attachment. And so it makes, and I want to use a couple of terms here. One is, so he says you need to draw the mind inward more, right? In this case, the experience is the mind jumping out, right, wanting to grasp at something out of desire, out of attachment. And then the word I want to use that I like here is that, so the idea is that you meditate on something disillusioning. I think that's a good term here. Right? Because the idea from a Buddhist perspective is that your mind grasping with desire as attachment in this context is caught in an illusion. Right? You're caught in the illusion that your mind jumping after those things will make you happy. That's why the mind's jumping there. Right? And so you have to disillusion yourself. Does that make sense? You have to take away the illusion so that your mind can settle back down. And so you're trying to kind of, in this case, the mind is too excited, right, it's agitated by craving or by desire or by attachment to things. And so you're trying to both bring the mind inward, settle the mind down, and disillusion yourself. Right? You take away the illusion that thinking about those things will make you happy, because it doesn't, is the idea. And so he says, And so here, before you were trying to think of something inspiring. Here, if you think of something inspiring, it will just get your mind more disturbed, more agitated. So you're trying to kind of settle the mind, bring it inward, and disillusion it. So he says so Lama Tsongkhapa now makes a list of what do you do then, right? What do you meditate? So one is, again, if you can just stop it, great. But if you can't stop it while meditating on your object of meditation, pause and meditate on something disillusioning, or kind of that draws the mind backwards and inward. So one point, the first thing he says is one option, again he'll give some options. One option is to meditate on impermanence. Right? And here, of course, impermanence is a humongous topic, right? Like, so, because one is, whatever your mind is jumping towards, right, you can think of the impermanence of that object, right? In other words, like, and actually there are many different points here that you do, right? Like, one is to think, like, oh, my mind is jumping towards, like, so say you're somewhere meditating and your mind's jumping towards, like, actually it's quite important, right? Like, so say you're meditating, right? And then your mind's jumping towards some person, for example, right? So one point is, actually at the time you're meditating, unless the person's sitting next to you, you don't even know if they're still alive, actually, right? So you're wanting, like, something with them, like for them or from them or something, right, for yourself from them. But actually you don't even know if they're still in existence, that person, right? Also, your mind kind of has this illusion that if you could grasp whatever the object is, a person or a thing, that it'll give you some kind of lasting happiness. But actually it won't. Right? In other words, first of all, like, because the person themselves is impermanent, or the thing itself is impermanent, right? So it's not always going to be there. Second is, whatever happiness you get from that person or that thing doesn't last, right? And we know that experientially. If you actually analyze your own experience, happiness is temporary, right? It's impermanent. And so if you start to notice your own experience of that, then it cuts through the illusion that if I could have this object, you may think of a thing, right? Like, oh, I want to get a new object at the store or something, right? But then you have to kind of contemplate, oh, if I grasp at that object, I'm grasping at it with some belief it's going to create real happiness for me, but of course, because of impermanence, it doesn't. Then also there's the impermanence of oneself, right? So meditating on one's own impermanence, like that life doesn't last forever, that you're going to die at some point, that you don't know when you're going to die. That we don't know that. So it's just true, right? And so what's important? And then that can kind of sober the mind, maybe, and you go back to your meditation. Right? So you can think about your own impermanence in death, the impermanence of objects, even the impermanence of all things, that everything passes away and disappears. And so the idea of if you recognize, first of all, if you recognize your own impermanence and mortality, that sobers the mind and decreases your grasping. But also if you recognize the impermanence of all things, then again it decreases at least the tendency to want to grasp at things, right? Because it's like grasping at stuff that's going to disappear. And so then you go back to your meditation. Another contemplation, and then he says within that one, there's also, in the Lama we already studied, there's a 9-point meditation on death. You could do that at this point. Then he says, also you can think about the faults of distraction, right? So you can think, actually, because one thing is quite interesting, right? If you notice this, what you start to realize is that, it feels like you're going after external objects, right? Like if you're thinking about, oh, I want to buy this at the store, I want to get that, or this person, or I want this person's attention or something. It feels like your mind's going outward to the actual thing. But of course, all your mind's really doing is going to a mental image, right? Like what's arising in your mind is actually a mental image of the thing at the store or the person, which is not the thing at the store or the person, right? And actually, if you start to watch your mind and think about it, if you contemplate this point, what you start to realize is like, well, I'm not even getting I'm not getting anything by my mind jumping to that. All that's serving to do is stop me from my goal, which is to develop meditative concentration in this moment. Right? So I'm sort of engaging with these mental images, and they're becoming a distraction from the mental image I want to focus on, which might be, for example, the image of a Buddha, and so on. And you can start actually contemplate, well, if I cultivate the meditative concentration, and if you understand the benefits of concentration, right, then you could actually contemplate like this. You could actually think, because he's saying here, collect the distracted mind by seeing the faults of the signs of distraction. So the idea here would be this, you might think, okay, wait, if I can cultivate meditative concentration and calm abiding on, in this case, let's say the image of a Buddha, I'll succeed in achieving all kinds of very wonderful goals spiritually. And also as a side effect of that, this comes in the teachings here, there's a kind of mental and physical bliss and pliancy or flexibility that come. So I'll achieve happiness through progressing, and eventually I can use that mind of calm abiding to realize emptiness, and I can achieve the great bliss of enlightenment. Right? Whereas if my mind jumps away to these mental images of something at the store or some other person, in this sense, some other person, instead of using them for my own happiness, right? That's the idea of desire here, or craving. All it does is block me from, it actually doesn't make me happy, right? If you watch your own experience, actually it's a mind of dissatisfaction, right? If you actually check, right? So that's what he's getting at, is like, well, if I let my mind keep jumping to objects of attachment, actually what I'm doing is I'm cultivating a mental habit of dissatisfaction in myself, and then I'll never be satisfied, right? You can actually think, people have, right? Like, you could, there's like, it's just true, isn't it? Is the fault of distraction. Like, people have that object, whatever it is I'm wanting, but they're not ultimately happy, right? And then people have way more than, like there are people, right, who have so much more than if I were to list all the things I'm craving, there are people who have much more than that, and they're incredibly unhappy, right? Like, and so having that doesn't lead to happiness, right? It's a kind of, what's the word? It's an illusion. That's why I was saying disillusionment, right? So you actually meditate on how this particular mind of dissatisfied craving, desire kind of mind, that kind of mind, that imagines I'll have happiness if I get this or that, right? Actually, we see that if you look in the world, right? People who, if people, what's the word? If people allow their mind without any limit to sort of just get habituated to that, then everything they get, they just want more, right? And then like, the mind never knows how to be satisfied and content. Right? There's actually interesting, like the cause of contentment is mostly practicing contentment. Right? You know, and the cause of gratitude is mostly practicing being grateful. You know, so anyway, you would think about all that. You would think about how happiness will come to me if I succeed in cultivating meditative concentration. It's not going to come to me if I allow my mind to stay in this habit of chasing after mental objects while I'm sitting here.
So, I have a question for that, like, what do you mean by that? Because, like, kind of like, let's say, like, a parent or a child, right? It's not something that, like, you, per se, like, crave, right? It's more like, pushing them the best, or, you know, trying to protect them. So, would that be some type of dissatisfaction in you, or is it like somewhere where you want to be with this person, you prefer it's like some type of enjoyment, like, oh, I want to hang out with this person because, you know, bring, like, she makes me laugh, or this or other things.
Yeah, here they're specifically talking about. I mean, in this part of the teaching, what Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about is specifically that kind of mind. The mind that's like, I want, like if it's a person, right? Like it's like, I want to be near this person because it makes me feel, because, like, so there's a kind of self-centered, there's a self-centered craving desire, in a way, like in other words, I want, like, and it's important to differentiate these, actually. I think you're getting at an important point. Like, because, you know, if it's like, say with family members, as which what you're mentioning, a parent or a child or something, oftentimes there's a mixture, isn't there? Like of genuine loving kindness, which is a positive, from a Buddhist psychological perspective. So the person, you might have like some moments of genuine loving kindness, which is a positive. But then oftentimes there are a lot of moments of self-centered craving. So for example, you know, in your example, right, if a person's thinking of, say, their child or something, or their parent, let's use that example, right? If a person's thinking of their parent and feeling, I want them to be safe and happy and well, that's love, right? But that doesn't have this uptight, grasping quality. You know, once it's like, but then there can come like, well, I want them to be safe and happy and well so they can be available for me and for what I need from them and what I want from them. Then it becomes self-centered craving, right? And when it becomes that, that's a different.
How's the former created or treated in this context?
Actually, it's interesting, like, right, because earlier Lama Tsongkhapa pointed out that, he pointed out that the main obstacle to meditative concentration is excitation, which is motivated by, I'm going to call it craving desire, or dissatisfied desire. The other minds, right? There are other mental states that are also distractions to meditation, but I think what he's getting at is those are much easier to overcome. Like, so in other words, if it's genuine loving kindness, you can just go, oh, good, I feel loving kindness, and I'm going to go back to my meditation. You know, it doesn't have that same grip on us, and so I think it would still be a distraction in that context. Like but actually, like if you think of Milarepa, right? Like he had great love and compassion, and then he thought, well, that's why I'm meditating, right? And then he went back to it, and actually it strengthened. I think in Milarepa's case, when he would feel love and compassion for others, he thought, well, the best thing I can do for them is to become enlightened and then go back and help them. You know, so loving kindness then if you were to dwell on it instead of your object of meditation, like he was doing, like Milarepa was famously doing Mahamudra, right? So if he but he would then go back to meditating on nature of mind, obviously. But those would still be a distraction, but they're not, well, I think what Lama Tsongkhapa clearly is saying in a way over and over, when he talks about excitation, is that it's specifically the main obstacle to meditation is this dissatisfied mind of craving or desire, and that's the problem. The other ones, while there's still distractions to meditation, I think are quite easy, especially if they're virtuous minds. They're quite easy, like love. They're quite easy to sort of say, well, good, and then come back to your meditation. I think, he doesn't get it. I mean, he gets into other places, like about the antidotes. Even like anger or hatred, right? He says that's an obstacle in meditation, clearly. And then he talks about how you meditate on love as an antidote to that. But I think what he's clearly saying is but it's this craving mind that's the main obstacle, because we're in the desire realm, and that sort of pervades our. If you start to meditate deeply, I think what he's saying is what you find is that that for most people that's the most pervasive. But anyway, they're all. I mean, but yeah, even that other mind, you would have to kind of say, okay, but then leave it aside and come back to your meditation. Or you won't.
Isn't introspection? I mean, it's inherent to the beginnings of the process, right? You begin to concentrate on an object of some kind. Automatically, I mean, the process is to identify when you've left that object and are doing something else. I mean, that is introspection, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, you'll see when we get into the reason why I mentioned that other point. One is he's saying mindfulness. You emphasize mindfulness more at the beginning, and also you'll see like there comes a point where. What's it say, right? Like, I guess it's this. At the beginning, the main thing we need is maybe I'll say it this way. There comes a point where introspection becomes particularly important or something, in order to sort of fine tune our meditation. But at the beginning, yeah, it's kind of a gross introspection of, well, am I thinking about something completely unrelated? Do I need to come back?
That is the practice.
But that is the practice, yeah. So it's still, yeah, so introspection is there from the beginning. Like there's a commentary by, that I was reading last night to prepare by Geshe Champa Gyatso, and he was saying that. He was saying, like, introspection is there from the beginning, but as you get to, like, the later stages of the middle state, not the late, but the middle stages of the 9 stages of progress, then introspection becomes very subtle and important and powerful at those points. Whereas at the beginning, you do need it, but it's not as powerful yet.
I remember that check up deer was one of Lama's favorite, just absolute mantras.
Well, there isn't. I mean, we have to notice if we're getting distracted or we can't come back. So.
But also motivations.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then he says, when intense or long-lasting excitement occurs, it is effective to loosen the meditation for a while and meditate on something disillusioning. That's what I was saying. Which I like that word, disillusioning. It gets at various points. Because one is it's sort of sobering, right? It implies a kind of sense of sobering the mind, but also implies cutting through the illusion that these other things will make us happy, which they won't.
It seems more desirable thing to do than focus on becoming depressed.
Yeah, he depressed, and that's why it says something depressing, which in this context I think I would translate sobering. I think is a better word.
I like it better too.
I wouldn't say depressing. I would say sobering. That'd be how I think it's a better. I think it gets more at the feeling of what's being gotten at. He says, and collect the mind inward, placing it every time it scatters. So we're bringing the mind more inward, he said. Then he says, when excitement is not that strong, you should collect the distracted mind inward and tie it to the object, right? So in other words, if your excitement is just weak, then just come back to your object and just sort of bring their mindfulness back. But if it's stronger, then you need to pause your meditation and go meditate on impermanence or the faults of distraction, which I just mentioned. And then he says, he makes another point. He says, you should not attend to inspiring or delightful objects because they will cause the mind to be more distracted outward. right? So you're not going to think at this point about, beautiful lights and things like that, because it'll just cause your mind more agitation. He kind of he stops this section there, but I'll just make a few other points that are from other commentaries. In addition to the points that he already mentioned, other techniques that a person can do at that point that are disillusioning or sobering or whatever. One is from the Lam Rim. You can think of remember there are we went through these earlier there are lists of the types of suffering of samsara, right? There are the 3 types of suffering, or the 6 types, or the 8 types, or the 10 types. If you think about the sufferings of samsara, that can help with this. Another is also that's to cultivate renunciation, right? The mind of definite emergence or renunciation. And again, because part of the issue with excitement is that we haven't developed enough renunciation, actually, right? And so any meditation that helps one to develop one's sense of renunciation. And also remember, think about the sufferings of samsara, remember this from when we talked about it, that there are those lists, and they're useful, they're how you meditate, they're the points you go through, but you have to relate it to your own experience. Does that make sense? So it's not just thinking about, there's this and that suffering, but then you think, well, those aren't foreign to what you've experienced from the time of your birth up to now that you can remember, because we all experience suffering. So you think about that. And again, it's sobering or disillusioning. It sort of makes the mind sort of remember, that samsaric processes aren't ultimately satisfying. And so you again remind yourself why you're seeking enlightenment itself. You can think of the suffering of various realms of existence. You can think of the faults. Again, there are many one of the things with attachment is that when we have the mind of attachment and grasping, we exaggerate the qualities of the object we're grasping at. So another technique that's often taught is thinking about the faults of whatever you're grasping at. And by thinking about the faults of it, it decreases the illusion of it being of the idealization of that object. And then one more point is that Khensa Rinpoche also, when he in the Easy Path mentions another technique that's not mentioned in this text, but is the vase breathing. And that's a technique where you I won't go through the details of every detail, but basically you kind of you breathe in and you kind of hold your breath, but you kind of you hold it you imagine holding it at your navel, at that level of the body. And there's because there's something grounding, I think, about that process and settling of the mind also. Because the mind in tantric context, they also talk about how the mind and the breath are connected. The mind and the subtle winds also are connected. And how your mind is moving and how you're actually, if you watch your breath, it's true, isn't it? You can notice it very easily. If you're very angry, your breathing changes. And if you're very caught up in desire, your breathing changes. If you're very caught up in jealousy, your breathing, your breathing's different when you're feeling kindness or compassion. And so there's some idea that here in this context that this mind of craving and so on, your breath and also the kind of subtle energies of your body are agitated. And so by holding the vase breath, they call it, so it's like a vase in your belly, your navel level, you can settle the mind. And that's described more in the book, so you can read it there. But those are all techniques to kind of decrease this sense of mental excitation in the mind and sort of bring the mind inward more. That one would particularly bring the mind inward, right? By focusing also at the navel, you're also you're sort of, retracting. That's what it is. You're retracting your mind back inward, and then you bring it back to wherever you're meditating on before. You don't stay at the navel you just do that as a technique, and then you go back to whatever your object of meditation was. And so then Lama Tsongkhapa says, that's the end of that section on how to stop excitement, mental excitement. And then he says, he has a little section here where he says, identifying the causes and dependence upon which laxity and excitement arise. And so here the idea is that another way of counteracting them is to know what causes them, because then you can decrease those causes. And so he goes through, first this causes, common causes, so things that can cause both laxity and excitement. So they can cause either. Does that make sense? And so some of the things that can cause either of the two, one is not guarding one's sense doors. So that means if you try to cultivate meditative concentration, guarding the sense doors means that while you're, like, so if you're in, so for example, if you're in a meditation retreat, right, that, remember Kirti Sencha Rinpoche, he spent 18 years in retreat in the Himalayas, right? And then he only came out of retreat, I think, when the Dalai Lama asked him to come teach, right? And Lama Zopa Rinpoche used to point out that Kirti Sencha Rinpoche, when he would walk, he was like a very disciplined monk, right? And he would just look at the ground in front of him. He wasn't like, he's like, Lama Zopa Rinpoche knows most people are like this, right, when you're walking around. And that he was like that. Like, he was guarding his sense doors. He was somebody who practiced guarding his sense doors, right? So in other words, it's like not, because actually this is true, isn't it? Is like, so one is if you're in a retreat, right, that you don't like do things that, and in this day and age that would also include like not checking your phone, for example, your email and all the other social media accounts, because that would be not guarding your sense doors, right? Because what's going to happen? Stuff's going to get in your mind. And actually, if you notice, right, if you notice this, like what happens, right? When you go to meditate, especially if you're doing a lot of meditation, is all the stuff that's been there, like that you've allowed into your sense doors, now is coming up in your mind, right? If you when you go do a retreat, right, like that often happens, right? So all of a sudden, like all the different thoughts and feelings and images start coming out. And so the idea here is, well, if you're trying to cultivate meditative concentration, that may happen. You can't prevent that, but you can at least stop. That's a process that will sort of, like mud that's, if you have like a pond and you stir up mud and it's all cloudy, well, if you leave it alone, it'll eventually settle and become clear water, right? But if you keep stirring it up, you're not going to make progress. So if you've had a lot of input from before, well, okay, that is what it is. But when you're trying to cultivate meditative concentration, if you keep having your sense doors engaged with objects, then you're going to keep stirring up the water and your mind's not going to settle. So the idea is when you're trying to really cultivate meditative concentration, you decrease how much you're taking in.
So that monk was still vigilant, but he wasn't going off the senses like when he's walking.
I think when he's walking, he would just walk.
Right. Yeah. It was like he was still concentrating and focus, but that's not to say that he wasn't vigilant.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah, because I'll say one more point about this one regarding the sense stories. I mean, first is like, nowadays, again, first of all, with social media, like, it'd be easy to, you could be, it's actually true, right? You could be like on a mountain somewhere, you could still be checking your email. So you have to be mindful of the effects of that, right, on concentration. And then another thing I'll say, like, I can't tell how many people I've had this, like I've talked to who had this, like where if they go to like group retreat, right, who say like, right, like, where they'll say, oh, well, I was, they say, what was it like? And they'll say, oh, well, there was this like cute person, like sitting over there near me, and I kept thinking about them, or like, it's like, well, okay, that's okay, but that's not really the purpose of going to retreat, so like, again, like not, like really being careful, what am I paying attention to? What am I focusing my eye consciousness or ear consciousness on, because then my mind goes to that, and then I'm not going to develop the concentration that I'm trying to develop. So whatever the thing is that's distracting us and causing, and actually, because it can be either, right, he's saying, so in this case I was giving examples of increased excitement, right, like desire, but actually if you're checking the news, it could also become depressing, so, and your mind can get lax. So either one, right, it's like, the idea is that you're not going to do that if you're trying to cultivate meditative concentration. You focus on whatever you're meditating on.
So you're not looking for total sensory deprivation, but just limiting inputs.
Yeah, like if you look in Shanti Deva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, it's actually interesting. Like he in his section on meditative concentration, he describes like you know, actually he describes beautiful kind of nature scenery. You know, he's like, what he's describing is sort of like decreasing all the drama of social, you know, all the stuff that sort of, whether it be family drama, political drama, you know, drama with friends, and he's saying like, you know, he noticed the sunlight in the trees, you know, in the mountains, and then he sat and meditated. You know, like it's sort of simple. So it's not cutting off all. You know, obviously we're not like closing our eyes and covering our ears and hiding. It's not that, but it's sort of it's the things that agitate the mind or that depress the mind or that distract the mind. And so oftentimes, actually, in the Buddha, I mean, if you think of like the actual texts, as I think about it, like many different texts that describe like going in retreat, they actually describe the pleasure of noticing, the pleasure of relating organically to the natural world, and then the simplicity of that. And actually, just recently, when I was in, I'll just share this very briefly. Recently, I was in Crestone, Colorado, where a lot of people do retreat. I was just visiting, and I saw Ani Sarah, a nun, who lives in a cabin or a hut, a little one-room thing, way up on a mountain, you know. And she was kind enough to invite me up there, and like, I was like, oh wow, this is what all those texts are, right? Like there was this sense of simplicity. Like, I mean, she has to carry the water up, like for example, you know, carry food up. Like there's no running water. There's no, but the sense of simplicity, like, and she was saying like, she sometimes hardly has any food. It's just very simple. Like, you know, like there's not lots of options. It's not a grocery store that she doesn't, you know, that she can get to very easily or anything like that. But the extreme simplicity of her life, she was saying, I'm just so happy, like, and content, and not worried about anything, and not upset about anything. And, you know, and it was like, I was like, oh wow, it's that. Like, I was just noticing like what the text is describing, like, and actually she made a point. She was funny. She said, you know, and if you come someplace like this, either you're miserable and you leave really fast because you hate it, or you get really happy because it's like it's just the simple beauty, and then you deal with your own mind, you know, and if you, I guess that was what she was kind of saying. I thought was like, and if you can, you know, if you can recognize your mind as the source of happiness and suffering, and you know how to cultivate happiness, then you become happy, and you can't blame anybody else, and you can't look to somebody else, and you can't, you know, so I think it's that. It's like, so we're, you know, so it's not like she wasn't being angry at the tree or something, you know, like, but oftentimes that's the issue, isn't it? It's like oftentimes for us when we're involved in sort of, you know, we have all these concepts about like, you know, this person should do this and it'll make me happy, and that person's doing that and it's making me upset, and they shouldn't be doing that, and this person should be doing this because then I'll be happy when they do that, and so on. And so it's cutting off that stuff, really, in terms of guarding the senses. Or, like, you know, possessions, right? Like, in other words, like if she were up there, if she were up on that mountain and she were searching the internet for, like, you know, where can I get the best chocolate cake, and I'm missing, you know, whatever, like, certain kind of cookie that I can't get, or, I mean, then she would be totally miserable, right? Like, so it's cutting off those kinds of, it's not just people, it could also be, you know, like that, right? Like, in other words, yeah, part of her point, she wasn't saying this literally, but it was like water and rice and, you know, whatever she was having, I don't know what she was eating, but fine, like that's not, I'm not here to have a luxurious, you know, I'm here to cultivate the path. So it's not just people, it's also stuff, but it's like the things that sort of make our mind grasp and get agitated. So it's just that, yeah, so it's not sensory deprivation, but sort of simplicity.
So I've been contemplating this, like, can you actually become like extremely spiritual in the city, or get to like this high levels of meditation, right, in the city, because there's so much sound pollution and like other stuff that, you know, that's going around us, right, and we kind of like somewhat ignore it, but we still are affected by it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what's your opinion on that? Like, do you have to, I'm not saying like you really want to get like spiritually, you have to go up in the mountains or woods or whatever, and just be in nature.
I guess one point I'll say, I mean, if I follow what, I mean, just following what Lama Tsongkhapa is actually saying, so using his answer to that, because he kind of answers that question. What I would say is this, is, you know, for cultivating love, compassion, ethics, generosity, you know, all those kinds of positive qualities, you can do those anywhere. Like you can be in the middle of Washington, D.C., and you can cultivate generosity. You can be middle of, you know, Manhattan, and you can cultivate ethics, right? And he even points out at certain points, right? Like, actually, there's more. He says, he made that point. He said, you know, for example, especially ethics, generosity, and patience. He says those are trainings that especially are suited to lay people in some ways and to a busy life, because you have more temptations to be unethical. You have more temptations to be impatient. You know, if you're living in the middle of a city and having all kinds of interactions. And so for those kinds of trainings and compassion, and especially the first three perfections, right? So generosity, ethics, and patience. He says, for those, being in a busy place is fine, actually. It's like quite, it could be, it actually can help you, right? And we often make that point, right? You can't practice patience if there are difficult people around, or noisy people, or annoying people, whatever. Like you need people to be provocative in order to be patient. And you need people who need something if you're going to be generous, right? You can't be generous if there's nobody, you can't practice generosity with others anyway if there's nobody around to be generous too, and so on. And the same thing with ethics. He says, like, you know, well, to say I'm not lying when you're not talking to anybody is not really an achievement. You know, but it's like when it's tempting to lie and you tell the truth, or when it's hard to tell the truth and you still tell it, that's really training in ethics. So for all those trainings, it's fine to be in a city. You know, it's fine to be in a busy place or whatever. But then he says, actually in the very beginning of the section on how to develop calm abiding, Lama Tsongkhapa says, he says if you want to cultivate calm abiding, it's good to go to a favorable place. I'm jumping back, and he says such a place it should be not too difficult to get enough food to survive. You know, there's basic necessities, food and water. There shouldn't be danger. It shouldn't be a dangerous place, like where people are going to burst in and rob you or something like that, or threaten your life. And then he says, though, he basically says it should be a place, though, that's simple, and where there aren't, where there should be few distractions, and not many. Where he says that it should be a place that's relatively quiet, where there are few distractions. And what he's getting at there is this: is that for most of the other trainings, you can be wherever you want. But if you're trying to really develop calm abiding, then, and actually he says if ideally there will be other meditators nearby. You wouldn't be alone either. It would be other people cultivating meditation nearby. And he says otherwise it's much more difficult to develop calm abiding. So he's saying for this particular achievement, the achievement of calm abiding itself, like really to progress in that, he says then, he's not saying it's impossible, but he's saying it's much, much more conducive to have a kind of environment like we're talking about. Someplace quiet, someplace with other meditators, someplace that's safe and, you know, kind of pleasant also. And when there's not loud noises, there's not. So he would say it's much harder. I think, I mean, this teaching says that, he says here, during the day there are a few people around, and at night there's little noise. So he's including that. He's saying, if you really want to cultivate calm abiding, the ideal place would be someplace where there aren't too many people around, where there are other meditators, and where there's not a lot of noise at night, because that'll allow your mind to settle and to develop this kind of concentration. And they sometimes say, because noise, for example, Ken Rimshi say, it's like a thorn in the mind if you're cultivating concentration. Because in other words, as soon as you hear a noise, your mind jumps to the noise. And so it's very hard to develop deep states of concentration initially. If somebody already has meditative calm abiding, then they can be anywhere. You know, they can. That's a different thing. That person then can go wherever they want. But to initially develop calm abiding, he says it's better to be someplace like that, quiet, with few people, with other meditators that's safe, or where there's enough food and water. So that's his advice on that question. Is that good? And so, like, oftentimes people who I mean, oftentimes what I've seen is that, people live wherever they're going to live to do all the other practices, but they'll often say when somebody's ready to really try to develop deep calm abiding, they'll go off and do a retreat someplace quiet. Another common cause of laxing excitement is not eating the right amount. And there what they say is if you're trying to develop meditative concentration, well, actually we all know this, right? If you eat, also if you're too hungry, then you're distracted, right, by hunger. But if you eat too much, your mind gets heavy, right? We often say that, right? Like, oh, after lunch, it's hard to, listen, or if you're at a lecture or something. And so there's a thing in the Easy Path that says, like, you should eat so that your stomach is like, what was it, 2/3 full, I think is what it said. It's like not totally stuffed, but not hungry. And so eating the right amount. And then it says, not putting effort into one's practice without sleeping during the first and last parts of the night. So that one means like getting the right amount of sleep is important if you're really trying to cultivate calm abiding. And part of what he's getting at here, actually, and this is true, is it's actually different also if you're living in a distracted, busy place versus when you're meditating. Actually, I'll make this point. If you're cultivating meditation, there is a specific guideline for this, that on the one hand, you shouldn't go without sleep, right? That's not a good idea. If you don't sleep enough, then you'll, what's that?
Hallucinate.
Yeah, you'll go crazy eventually. And at the minimum, you'll be tired, right? But also, it's just not good for your body or mind. But there comes a point where you need a little less sleep. If you really are cultivating meditative concentration, you don't need as much sleep as you do if you're not. So he's saying that at that point you can sleep less, but still continue to sleep at night. So he's saying, so sleep. There's like a certain period of the night where you should sleep, but it's okay to sleep less, but you don't stop sleeping, and you don't get so little sleep that it's not good for your body. And remaining without introspection. So in other words, if you're not doing introspection, if you're not practicing introspection, as Jeff pointed out, your meditation's not going to go well. Then he says, then there are causes of laxity specifically. One is great sleepiness, right? So in other words, if you're not getting enough sleep and you're tired, your mind's not going to have the clarity and the vitality that it needs. Also, the mind being excessively loose in its hold on the object, right? So like letting your mind be too slack. Like we used that metaphor one time of a guitar string that's not tight enough. If you let your mind be like that, you can have laxity. Another one is not balancing calm abiding with special insight, but relying on calm abiding too much. So here what he's getting at is, right, ultimately what we want is a union of calm abiding and special insight. And then sometimes you'll hear this in Sanskrit, right? That's shamatha and vipassana. So the idea here is that here you're trying to cultivate calm abiding mainly, right? But what he's getting at is that we need to also cultivate special insight. Even along the way, ultimately we need a union of them later in the path. But even along the way, so to do the contemplations or an analytical meditations, I'll call them, on special insight will help keep the mind sharp. So that's another one. Allowing their mind to remain as though in darkness, and not taking joy in directing the mind towards the object. So joy here means, right? Remember the definition of joyous effort, right? Joyous effort is cultivating a habit of taking joy in what's positive or virtuous, right? And I said that before, like people take joy in anything, actually, right? Like, I mean, people, if you look around the planet, like all kinds of weird things people take joy in, and destructive things, and horrible things even, actually, people take joy in. So here, what he's saying is, if you learn to take joy in the process of meditation itself, that'll help overcome laxity, right? Joyous effort helps overcome laxity. So cultivate a mind that learns, and that means being wise, right? It means being smart about your practice. Like, so if right from the beginning, if you push yourself and you're like, what's the word? Like grinding on your process feels like a grind or something, then you're not going to find it joyful. Then it's going to become a problem later on. So you should approach your practice in a way that is enjoyable, right? And cultivate a mind that enjoys the practice. and then you'll want to keep doing it. You'll want to do it more and more, right? So that's part of that, right? It's not, so when it says learn to take joy, it means practice joyous effort, and it also means, therefore, practicing in a way that is sustainable and is enjoyable, right? And so practice should, especially meditation practice, I just think that, like, a lot of people start, some people, like, I've met a lot of people, like, there are people who, like, their meditation practice is like this and then drops off to nothing, right? Or, like, goes up a little and then goes down. And then there are people, like, who are more like that or something. And I think it should be more like this, actually, like, there should be less at the beginning and then gradually more and more. And the reason it should become more is because the person is feeling joy, actually, right? Like in other words, it shouldn't become more because somebody told you to, or because you're supposed to, or because it should be like, and actually, especially with this meditative concentration thing, practices, they're intrinsically, if you're making progress, it's intrinsically enjoyable, actually, right? In other words, it actually, there comes a point, like at the end of, when you develop calm abiding, that they say you experience this kind of extreme physical and mental bliss. But even at the beginning of meditation, and as you progress, that's actually not all at once, right? I mean, there is a kind of all at once quality at that point that's very intense, but they say. But even at the beginning and along the way, there are experiences of pleasure, physical and mental pleasure that come from meditation. And so if you're doing it right, it shouldn't be hard to cultivate joy. But that means not pushing yourself, but going at a pace where you do short sessions at the beginning, and you start to feel some sense of, oh wow, that's peaceful, and then like, oh wow, that's pleasurable, and oh wow, that's, and then people want to do more practice because it's working, Whereas if you're pushing yourself expecting some big result quickly, then you'll just get frustrated, because that's not how meditation works. You don't get some big result quickly. What does the Dalai Lama say? There's no cheap, quick, it's not like, there's not a cheap, quick version. It's not like it's not a fast food version of meditation. And that's what the Dalai Lama was saying. So we have to so that's part of cultivating joy. Then he says, what are the unique causes of excitement? And he says, the causes of excitement are said to be little disillusionment. And again, like, that was that term I liked, but another translator here called that one renunciation, too little renunciation, right? So if you haven't meditated enough on those topics and you go off to do retreat, then you'll just feel dissatisfied, actually. So it's a mistake, actually. You shouldn't go, because it would be a mistake to rush off to do some kind of solitary retreat or something. It's better first to meditate on the topics in the Lam Rim, actually, the stages of the path to enlightenment. And then there comes a point, if you develop the renunciation, for example, and compassion and bodhicitta and so on, where then doing retreat is like a natural outgrowth of your practice. And that's, I think, how it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to, if the person were going off to retreat and they felt like they were going off to prison, then they shouldn't go off to retreat. It's like, that's a mistake, right? It should feel like, oh wow, I get to do this, great. Like, I finally get to do what I really want to do, And so that comes from the sense of disillusionment with samsara, right? Where the person is feeling like, well, this other stuff is boring, actually, right? Like, or even like something's boring or something's kind of gross, right? Like, oh, like, I don't know, like, who would want to do that? This is what's, and so, if you don't have that mind, then the mind is always grasping at something, right? Like, and that's the excitement. So we have to meditate on those other topics first. Does that make sense? Then he says, or the mind being excessively tense with respect to its object. Like, so that's where, like, if somebody meditate with like that, so, like, they're meditating with, like, too much tension, and there should be a little bit of tension, right? Like, there should be a little bit of energy there, but it should be subtle. It shouldn't be uptight, and that's a cause of excitation. And then he says, or the mind being too distracted, essentially, by thoughts of relatives and the like. And there again, it's getting at what you were saying earlier, your question. Here he's talking about too distracted by thoughts of desire or craving or grasping at those people, in this case. And then he makes a few more points here, just mentioned briefly. One is, so he says, you need to recognize through your introspection even subtle aspects of laxity and excitement in order to stop them all entirely. He says, if you give up thinking, well, you know, it's like basically discouragement is what he's getting at here. Well, he's actually getting at 2 points. One is he's saying don't become discouraged if it's difficult at the beginning, because it will be. You know, as if you're not used to meditative concentration, it's not going to come like that, right? There's no, like I said, there's not a quick, easy version, no fast food version of this. But then he says also, but also don't, like, let's just say this right, that to overcome lasting excitement takes effort. Does that make sense? Like, there's that you actually have to be, it takes effort to notice the subtle versions of them, and it takes effort to overcome them. And that effort brings a big payoff in terms of your experience of meditation. But you should go into it expecting that. In other words, that it's going to take effort to fine tune. You know, and it's like, I guess I'll make a point. It's, you know, earlier I used I mean, he used the example, and I did too, from him, of fine tuning a guitar. But it's also like, it'd be like learning an instrument. You know, if somebody said, "Oh, I want to become like a concert pianist or something," but I expect it to be really easy. And I expect it to somehow, you know, like, within a few weeks I should be able to, like, play at Carnegie Hall. That's, like, ridiculous, right? Like, whereas anybody would know, well, no, if you're going to do that, it's going to take years of effort, right? Like, and it's going to take training and practice and hours of practice, and then, you know, or like, remember they used to come to the center, Mark Olivia, wonderful, they're a couple who do great, beautiful violin playing. And I remember I was talking to him, and he was saying, like, I was like, you know, he's played in all kinds of prestigious places, and I've heard them play, wonderful violinists. But he was saying, like, oh yeah, like, if you're trying to, I forget how many hours it was, like, if you're trying to improve at violin, you have to practice, like, 5 or 6 hours a day or something like that. And just to stay even, like, so you don't lose it, you have to practice at least, I forget what it was, maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours a day. Not to lose his ability to play at the level he could play at. And so, you know, I was like, well, how long have you been doing that? You know, I can't remember, it was like 30 years or something, like 40, I can't remember the number, but years and years, like decades. Like, and we know that, right? Like, you know, if somebody's going to play in, you know, the Kennedy Center and violin, that they should have, or piano or whatever, that it takes that much effort. And I guess the point is like, it's a little, you know, and to fine tune the ability, right? And what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is like, you know, that anybody, you know, is like, you can learn to meditate, you can do this, and you can develop calm abiding, but calm abiding is like, the achievement of calm abiding for a meditator is a bit like playing at Carnegie Hall for a violinist. So it's going to take effort if you want to achieve that level of aptitude or capacity in meditation, and to get rid of the subtle versions of obstacles, right? That you're going to have to make effort to overcome them, and that'll take time and effort.
Right.
Yeah.
What about that? I get a little stuck on not stuck, but when you said violin, something that absolutely speaks to my heart. I love violin music. I aspire to be the greatest violinist, except for, unfortunately, I sucked at it, and I wasn't actually allowed to practice at home. So, to be that violinist at Carnegie Hall is like, oh, you know, so that would require, well, talent. Number one, I guess that's the piece. The other piece is I can kind of like say, okay, you know, desire, you know, that those things I can aspire to, but where's the talent piece? Where's the equivalent of the talent piece come in? Does that have to do with like where you are and the eons and eons and eons it's going to take for us to ever, if...
Yeah, actually, I'll say something about that. Like, 'cause I think you're raising a good question, which is first of all, from the Buddhist perspective, right? It's actually interesting. Talent, like, I mean, right? The Buddha's primary teaching is nothing. Right? If we were, the Dalai Lama says, if you were to come up with like a slogan for all the Buddhist teachings combined, it would be, all things arise dependent upon other causes and conditions. Right? Dependent origination is the essence of Buddhism. And so even talent then doesn't come about from nowhere. It comes about from previous causes and conditions, would be the fundamental Buddhist worldview, right? and whether that be music or anything else, that any talent or any facility or capacity or natural ability at something comes from previous training. And so then in terms of meditative concentration, actually I'll share a few that, like, one thing that's commonly actually noted is, actually I'll share this, like one time I was talking with Venerable Rene, who's a great meditator. I don't know if you met him, a monk, a Western monk from Europe, who's a great, wonderful person, a great meditator. And he was saying this point, he said to me one time, he said, you know, he was cultivating calm abiding. He was like doing retreats on that. And he would sometimes ask like certain lamas for advice or something about obstacles. Like he was like, well, what do you do when you have this kind of obstacle or something? And he was saying that some of those great lamas, like when he would ask them, like they could say what the text said, like a book said, but they actually couldn't answer based on experience because they had such an easy time developing calm abiding. They never had, like they went in retreat, and he was saying like, they were like, oh, I just want, you know, like their experience in this life was they went in retreat and they immediately developed calm abiding in a few months, and it was no big deal or something for them. And so they couldn't experientially, like they could say, well, the book says this, but then like he had to find somebody, he was saying, I had to find somebody who didn't have as much talent at calm abiding and ask them the question, because they could then explain, oh, I went through that actually, and this is what I did, like this is how you really deal with it or something, more than just what it said in the book, because they had actually gone through it. So I guess the point is like, they say, I mean, and there are many examples of this, where if somebody had calm abiding, like if they've cultivated that from lifetime to life, you know, many lifetimes in a row, then it's very easy. Whereas if we're new at it, then it's harder. Is one point, right? So that talent in meditation would partly be that. But then it's interesting if you think about it, right? So then if you think, if we were to think for ourselves, well, okay, so I don't have that, like, I'm clearly not somebody who like developed calm abiding the last 10 lifetimes in a row, and when I sit down, it's going to suddenly happen. That's obvious, right?
Right, like, so you quit aspiring for Carnegie Hall after you're told you suck and you can't practice at home, right? So you stop aspiring for Carnegie Hall.
And here's the trick, I think, with meditative concentration, though, is like, one point is, you have I guess a few things. One is, as we put effort into it, we're developing that habit, is one point. Second point is, whatever effort we put in, we get some benefit, and if we're doing it correctly, we get benefit right now. You know, because even if you develop a little bit of, you know, if you just make some progress in your meditative ability, you get some benefit from that. That's another, right, immediately, I mean, in this lifetime. But another point is, like, a few more points. Another one is we don't really know what our capacity is, actually. So as we try, you know, then we don't know what our karma is from past lives, so sometimes maybe something will come along in our own experience that helps us. But the last point I want to make is the most important one, which is, actually, I'll say it this way. I remember one time I was talking with, I was talking with a Lama, and he said something to me like, well, it's really good you're doing this, whatever, it was like some Dharma, you know. And he said, because in a future life, suddenly, like, you'll have some experience, like, you'll be making some effort, and suddenly it will all come together, and you'll have some really good experience. Without, like, you know, spontaneously. And it'll be because of the karma you're doing now. Like, and I was like, oh, it won't happen in this life, you know, that particular thing. But it was like, but I guess the point that he was getting at was like, you know, like you look at someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche or something, where, you know, like, appearances like he had calm abiding from the time he was born, I think. But that came about from causes also, right? So like, I guess the point is, if you study, even just studying these teachings, right, we're creating imprints, is the idea. And just by listening to them and thinking about them and then trying them out a little bit, you're creating habits or imprints in your mind that will eventually lead to results. You know, and causality is right, according to, like, what the point in Buddhism is that cause and effect are unfailing, right? That's what Lama Tsongkhapa says over and over again, right? So, you know, whether it'll bring a result next year or 5 years from now or a number of lifetimes from now, we don't know. We can't control that, actually. But if you're making the correct effort, it will bring a result, is the idea. And so, yeah, so then it's not wasted in that sense, especially if you're doing it with the correct motivation and you dedicate, if you dedicate it with compassion, that someday that will lead to the intended result, and it may be in this life or maybe in the future life. Because that, again, and I think that's important, like even the Dalai Lama often points it out. He says, we shouldn't worry too much about when, because we don't have control over that, actually. Like, that's the point, we don't really have any, we could say, oh, I want it to happen right now or something, but that won't make it happen. And even Bonker Rinpoche in one of his things says, and the opposite's also true. And there's, you could say, well, oh, I don't think I'll have this result in this life, and then maybe it happens. And then he gives some examples of like Tibetan teachers, meditators who would have thought, oh, that's, that'll be some some distant future lifetime, and then something just like, because of the purity of their practice and the sincerity, then things happen, and they said, oh wow, I wouldn't have expected that. But the point being, like, we can't control that part. What we can control is making the correct effort. And the point is, one other thing I'll say, is also that, that it's impossible. Again, because you said, like, over time, right? I guess the point being, it's that whether we achieve calm abiding in this life or in some future life, that if one is going to practice the bodhisattva path, one has to eventually achieve it, right? Because otherwise one doesn't progress. The only way to progress through the 5 stages of the 10 movies or 10 grounds of a bodhisattva, you have to achieve calm abiding at some point. So if we don't create those imprints now, then whether it be this life or some future life, we won't achieve the results. So to know, well, okay, so I'm creating those imprints, and if it happens in this life, great. If it happens in a future life, that's fine. But I'm doing it with that motivation of achieving enlightenment. That's the important part. Out of compassion, I think that's the important part. But yeah, so because we don't really know like what our own aptitude is though for that. And does that kind of answer? I'm not sure if that answers. Because yeah, if you don't do it now, then if sometimes people make the mistake, and actually later in the text, Lama Tsongkhapa gets at that, is a huge mistake would be to think like, oh, I can't, and therefore I won't try. He says like that's the worst. That's a terrible mistake, actually. Yeah.
And we seem to be kind of trained in that direction. Either you think you're going to be the president or play at Carnegie Hall, or you're going to give it up and accept that all you're going to ever do is mop the floors. They never talk to you about, you were not taught about every step of it's a good step of it and a good part of the journey, and to celebrate that part of the journey.
Yeah, think about what the Dalai Lama's favorite saying is, right? Like, for as long as space endures, for as long as sentient beings endure, may I too endure the benefit to relieve the misery of the world, right? So as long as Dalai Lama often points this out, right? His idea is like, right? As long as the motivation is compassion, he says that the time we shouldn't worry too much about the time frame, because there are infinite, people and creatures suffering, and that we just have to make effort at the practice, and actually, in his commentary, actually, again, I was reading the Dalai Lama's commentary last night also, and he was making a point actually about related to this, which is he said, he was making this point. He said, like, which the Dalai Lama often emphasizes, where he said, sometimes people think like, oh, preserving the Dharma or like benefiting the teachings or something is like building a building, building a monastery, building a school or something. And he said those things are good. He said, but the real way of preserving the teachings is to practice it yourself. And he said, is preserving it in your own inner experience. And he said, that's the most important contribution we can make. And I was like thinking, wow, that's interesting, right? As long as he's saying like, as long as Dalai Lama is saying this point about like, because I guess part of what I think is implied in this discussion is, it's easy to think like that if I'm sitting alone somewhere just trying to cultivate meditative concentration, well, how does that help anybody? It would be easy to think that. But what the Dalai Lama is saying is, it does help others. In this life and in future lifetimes and over time, and because of the web of interdependent relationships, that your silent hour somewhere meditating does benefit others if it's motivated with bodhicitta. And that's the way of preserving the Dharma, actually. Like, that's the activity. And like, we would often think, well, if I built some big thing and there was a plaque that said, like, Lisa Richard built this, like, monastery, so that would seem like some big deal. And that's what Lama was getting at, is he's saying, like, no, your quiet meditation is preserving the Dharma for future times, because if you're practicing sincerely, is what he was saying. And there are many ways in which that's true, right? One is, like what that Lama was saying, which the Lama was implying, right? Which is some future life you gain that realization and then you benefit others. But the other is even that example of, the example I just gave of Ani Sarah, right? Like, looking at her, I was very inspired, but that's true on many different levels. Like, who gets inspired by you, and who gets, that's also there, right? Like, and so if you're practicing sincerely and then somebody sees that, you don't even know the impact sometimes. So, like that.
Every mantra counts.
Yeah, every month. I don't guess I'll just say one more brief point on that. Like, I was just a much more mundane example. I was just down in, I was just last weekend. I was down for a few days. I was down in Florida because my mom had a heart attack. She's okay, but and she practices. She loves practicing Tonglen, taking and giving meditation, and medicine Buddha practice. And she has like this group of older. She's in her mid-70s, and she has this group of some a little younger than her, some a little older, who come to her house and meditate together, just because they love to meditate with her. And she was saying, like, oh, there's this woman, she keeps calling me because she loved the meditation so much, and she wants to come back, but I'm trying to decide when to start again, because after the heart attack I can't rush. And I was like, oh wow, like, you don't know who you'll be the inspiration for. I was like realizing, I was realizing she's being the inspiration for this other person. And I was like, oh, how sweet that is, and the fact that she would still be meditating after her, like, she's laying in bed and meditating sometimes, not all day, but a few times a day, because she can't do other stuff right now much. And that's inspiring to me, actually, but I was seeing, like, oh, all these people are inspired. Like, there were many people I was seeing, like, oh, this other guy wants to come over and meditate with her, and like, so you don't have to be some great, my point is, like, you don't have to be some great Lama to be an inspiration also to others. And that comes about partly through your own practice of meditation. So it does benefit others in many ways. Like your own practice does. Maybe we should do the verses of dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends.